Good morning, everybody, administration, council, and guests. Welcome to the first budget committee of the Finance Committee for 2019, considering amendments to the 2020 budget. A couple of logistic reminders I have for you today is that in order to be heard on the system and on the live stream, you need to press your microphone. The microphone will come on automatically. You don't have to be recognized. But please turn your mic on and off so that the mics are in free flow mode. And if you leave your mic on, your coughing and sniffing and everything else will get picked up. So you are responsible for controlling your microphone. Again, a reminder that the Finance Committee bylaw has me, CAO, as an official member of the committee and allows for either the mayor or the CAO to chair. In this more informal setting of the committee, I typically chair more as a facilitator, so I will acknowledge you. You can put your mic on, but please raise your hand and I will try to acknowledge you to speak. We have a full agenda and we're scheduled to go right till 1 o'clock. We will take a break between 10:30 and 11ish and in a natural sort of place in the agenda. So also please, similar to council, just put your cell phones away and we will be able to check messages, etc. during that break. What else did I want to say? There are some cords across the floor, so if you do get up and move back, there's some water, etc. at the front. Just please watch the cords. They're not taped down. We don't want you to trip. As I said, we do have a full agenda today, and we have a scheduled meeting for next Tuesday that is a placeholder. It's possible that we could get through all of the agenda today and get through some of the motions, etc. We won't get to making motions as outlined in the staff report that Chelsea Richardson has prepared until after all discussion, but it's possible that we get there. If we don't get there, that's fine. We have the meeting next Tuesday that we can continue on our discussions today. But there is not expected to be a new package for next Tuesday's meeting. It's just a continuation of this discussion. We also have some guests here, Martin Bean from the Commission, so he, Chelsea will call Martin up when it's the appropriate time in our discussion. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Chelsea, and she'll walk us through a bit of a presentation.
Thank you. So as Ms. DeSoto had mentioned, we do have quite a full agenda this morning. To kick us off, I'm recommending we go through a little bit about the process and how we ended up here today, what our process has been with regards to bringing the amendments forward, as well as some key policies. Then we'll get into the proposed amendments themselves. So we'll start with some presentations from Mr. Bean and Mr. Asarte on some transit. Of course.
My apologies, but our newest general manager has just advised me that I actually haven't called the meeting to order and approved the agenda. We have a formal meeting process, so she's on the ball, and I'm not. So sorry, Chelsea. So I'm just going to interrupt you. So as chair, I will call to order and I guess I should have done this right at the very beginning. The Finance Committee for Thursday, November 7th, 2019. And I will look for approval of the agenda. Are there any amendments to the agenda? Any questions? Okay, all in favor? Great, and then we have no delegations. There are minutes in the package from October 22nd. Are there any changes, errors, or omissions to the minutes? Okay, seeing none, I'll move that the minutes be adopted as presented. All in favor? Great. Now, Chelsea, you can take it.
was I? Okay, so once we have the presentations, then we'll continue to go through the amendments. We'll start with an overview of operating and capital, similar to how we've presented them historically. This year, as we went through the amendments, we did notice that there were kind of three buckets or trends that we were noticing. So this year, we have separated the operating and capital items into whether these amendments have arisen as a result of council direction and priorities, uncontrolled third-party costs, or items that we're bringing forward from administration. And then we'll go back and conclude kind of overall where each of those amendments leaves us again in terms of the total of those proposed amendments. Then we can talk about the impacts, both in terms of taxes on our reserve balances, debt levels, and then mainly as an administration item, but we do also need to discuss there are 3 2019 projects that haven't been started that we'll need to also formally cancel. So with that, starting with our view of the overall process. So as a reminder, in 2018, Council approved the 2-year operating and capital budget covering both 2019 and 2020. So we currently have a 2020 approved budget. At this time, for the amendments, the budgets were not opened up for a comprehensive review. The amendments are really meant to be an exception, and that's what we highlighted for our supervisors and managers as they brought forward items, is that they're meant to meet, as per our guidelines, the criteria of being extraordinary, unexpected, or emergent. The flow for these changes, they came from supervisors or managers to their GM, then once reviewed by the GM, they were brought forward to the CST for consideration. As outlined in the budget and business plan guidelines, with multi-year budgets, the focus is on departments operating within their approved multi-year budget rather than focusing on an individual year in isolation. As such, if 2019 results in a departmental surplus, the department is given the opportunity to carry over the surplus to assist their operations in 2020, given that if they have a compelling argument and with approval from the CAO, and that is meant to exclude any one-time unbudgeted revenue. Conversely, if there's a shortfall, the department would be expected to overcome that deficit in 2020. That said, there are no anticipated shortfalls for any departments as a whole. A number of policies may relate to some of the amendments to be discussed today. However, there are 3 main policies that were taken into consideration throughout this process: the debt management policy, the reserves policy, and the property tax policy. So where we're using funds from reserves, we are ensuring that they appropriately met the definition of that reserve. I'm not going to get into more of this at this time, but at the end, when we get back into the impacts on our debt and reserve, we'll come back and talk about how those are in alignment with the policies. Since the 2019 and 2020 budgets were approved, there have also been some changes to capital items, either through council resolutions or transfers that are approved by the CAO. So just to give you a bit of a highlight, I'm just going to pull that spreadsheet up just so you can see what's happened so far this year. So at the top are all the capital budget changes that have been approved by council through resolutions. So you can see that totals an additional 1.7 in capital projects that have been approved since the 2019 budget was approved. Additionally, there are transfers that can be approved by the CAO. So these are a number of changes that you can see. They're just transfers in and out of different projects. The key one I'd like to highlight is the TIP 20. The box is around the items related to that as we consolidate a number of individual projects into one major project.
This was the page 44 of the
Right, I was just going to pause there and see if there are any questions on that. This is something that Council had asked, or the Finance Committee had asked for at budget time last year, is that we transparently show all of the transfers in and out of capital budget items and consolidations of projects. So there were several projects in TIP 20 that Ms. Richardson was just talking about that have been consolidated to make one project for 2019. And then in 2020, there's going to be a further consolidation of 3 more projects into that TIP 20 budget. So moving forward, we only report on TIP 20 as a whole. That's clear? Okay, great, thank you.
Question here.
Yes, Bob?
So the funding source is listed on the side, right? And for instance, the Canmore Recreation Scoreboard replacement, that's a 15,000 sponsorship. So when you add up the column to 1.692, we're not actually requisitioning more taxation for that, right? For that 1.692, we're just transferring things out of
Right.
within the year?
So all of the top box were all individual motions. You'll see the resolution
Right.
number of council. So when council approved the addition of that project, you approved the funding source.
Okay.
Yes, and you're correct. There was no funding from taxes.
So there's no taxation, that's just the funding that was added from all the different sources on the right-hand side of the
Right.
screen? Okay. All right, now, the amend Lions Park Tennis Court expansion of 170, that was taken out? Or was that transferred to the next year? It was reduced by 170?
It was reduced by $170,000 because the tennis club did not get the grant.
Right.
And so the whole project ended up being reduced. We're reapplying for a new grant on a reduced scope.
Okay. And so that factors into 2020 then? That was taken out of 2019?
This is 2019.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So that doesn't, it's not reflected on this page what happens after that was taken out. It's just 2019 it was taken out of.
Correct.
Okay, all right. Because there's pluses and minuses in this column. I was just trying to make sure that I understood what was coming in and what was going out. So, okay, great, thanks.
If there aren't any further questions on these changes, then while we're on the subject of tip 20, Mr. Asarte, if you want to come up and speak to tip 20 and the financial implications.
Okay. This isn't part of the decision-making process for Budget Committee at this time. However, it is an item that we'll need to consider likely in the new year. And that is the funding sources for active transport and transit components of TIP 20. So currently we have a funding source of Green Trip for a significant portion of that work. That over the course of late 2018 and early 2019, we were working with Alberta Transportation to review eligibility. And through those discussions, it was expected that much of that scope won't be eligible. So originally the scope was for a transit hub, and our project to integrate different transit systems was to create that integration at Bow Valley Trail Benchlands, where we have the on-it stops, regional stops, and local stops. And so we're working towards having as much of the project eligible as possible, but components that we would have expected to be incorporated into that project weren't eligible. So in response, we applied for and were approved for an Alberta Community Transit Fund grant, which more explicitly included elements like pathways, sidewalks as eligible scope. And that grant that was approved was for 2.1 million. And the intent was to come this fall and have a funding source change that included some additional gas tax and the Alberta Community Transit Fund grant, replace much of the Green Trip grant, and that be the funding picture for the project. However, the province has since canceled the Alberta Community Transit Grant program. And so that leaves us with a large hole in the project's funding right now that we have a number of ways we're working to look at filling. We have received in the 2018 year additional gas tax dollars that we weren't anticipating and had anticipated applying those to the project when we bring that forward to council. We'll maximize the Green Trip eligibility, use off-site levies where eligible, We will potentially have to delay portions of the project. And so we're looking at getting updated cost estimates fairly shortly based on the designs that were taken out for the October 3rd open house. And portions of the project may have to be delayed, which would allow us time to apply in for a federal grant which has an allocation for CAMWAR and requires us to apply in. And that grant actually is funding a number of projects that the Commission, through BAMF and the Transit Commission, applied into ACT for. So ACT disappeared, but some of the funding sources for ACT came from the federal ISIP grant. However, that wasn't the case for TIP 20. So we'll have to go with a separate application now. But we expect that that would be the scope that we would delay would be eligible for application into that grant, and that we could fund that work for 2021 through that program as an option. So right now we're working through putting together a picture, getting more information, working with the province to see how much of the scope is eligible, getting those updated cost estimates, and we anticipate coming back in the new year with a revised funding picture to get approval ahead of getting tenders out for that work.
Mayor Bourmont?
So, Andy, just kind of high-level worst-case scenario, best-case scenario?
Best case scenario, we can have enough eligibility between Green Trip and the gas tax to be able to complete the scope that we have in the project. Worst case, I think we would likely have to delay a portion of the project, perhaps the Palliser Benchlands portion, and apply into ISIP and complete that work the following year. That's kind of a likely scenario. Worst case would be that we weren't able to get an ISIP grant, and that would just be a hole in the budget. Then we would be looking for alternative sources, of which, based on a comprehensive plan that's been looked at by finance and the organization, there aren't free dollars floating around. The dollars are accounted for in a lot of important projects out there. So it would likely mean looking at the budget in the fall of next year to see how all the priorities shake out. But that would definitely be a challenging scenario if it wasn't to get an ISIP grant.
So just follow up on that. So what's your expectation on timeline now with this information in hand?
We'll be able to, I believe, make a decision with council or present a recommendation to council for decision in the new year. So in January, early February, ahead of when we plan to tender the surface works for the project.
So you're expecting the project to proceed more or less on the same timeline, but ultimately maybe less work?
A significant portion of the project is funded by other sources, and certainly anticipate the intersection work, pathway work along Bow Valley Trail, and all of the utility work to not be impacted by this and to proceed as planned. We are planning on putting that tender out in late February, early March, and so we do have a couple of months to decide, and all of the work is in packages that can be added or removed from a tender based on the progress we make over the next couple of months.
Thanks.
One of the things I wanted to add to that discussion was just that through this process, we've really just been looking at 2020 combined with 2019 in isolation, and we haven't looked into the next 4 years of our capital plan, which, you know, given some of the announcements out of the province and the reduction in MSI grants and some of the grants we're seeing, you know, that weren't necessarily part of a budget announcement, but in dribs and drabs we're seeing other grants canceled or deferred or reduced. So through 2020, we're going to have to look at that entire capital plan and see what needs to be pushed out, reprioritize potentially, look at eligibility. So there will be a larger scope of work through 2020 to look at the full 6-year plan, rolling 6-year plan. So were there any other questions regarding TIP 20 or the funding hole? basically stay tuned. We're going to do some work with the province to improve the eligibility of some of our components. Okay.
Esme?
So when you say improve the eligibility of our projects, how do we do that exactly?
That process is to review the scope with Alberta Transportation, who administers the Green Trip grants on behalf of the province, and have them make a determination as to what's eligible. So now that we have more comprehensive designs put together, that's the step we're taking.
So do you think that that might improve our eligibility, in fact?
We are going to push to have as much of the project included as possible. It, in our opinion, is all eligible based on the need to have bus stops and the bus system integrated with a sidewalk network. So we'll continue to push to have as much of the project included in that eligibility as possible.
And what would the timeline be for that decision from the province?
It would be likely in the next 6 weeks or so. We'll have a better idea of that. We're working with the Commission right now to put a package together for some Green Trip amendments and decisions, and Mr. Bean's expecting that to go out end of next week, and that'll initiate those discussions.
So before Christmas, we'd have an answer, you think?
Potentially.
Okay. Thank you. And you'll update council on that as it goes along,
We will.
presumably? Thanks.
Great, okay. Chelsea.
And so one last piece about the overall framework with which we were looking at the amendments. We also did consider the strategic framework with regards to council's strategic priorities. And so when we get to the council directed and priority items, we also identified how they fit within these 6 categories where possible. So now we'll get into the proposed amendments themselves. So as I'd mentioned, we have broken them into operating and capital, similar to how we've looked at them before, but we've also taken this approach of grouping them into the 3 buckets to try to look at somewhat like items together. Within that structure, next up we have the presentation from Mr. Bean with regards to the Transit Commission.
Great, thanks. Good morning, Mayor and Council, Administration. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about transit, the amendments that we believe are necessary. Just a couple pages up on the screen here. We have between capital and operating about a $20,000 change in the requisition, and then another ask for regional service as well. Just with the, just as an overview, with the increase in ridership that we've been seeing, some increased expenses occur and some increased needs, and that's a big reason for asking for these changes. Just a touch on the ridership on the key routes that affect Canmore. On Route 5, the Canmore local service, we're at 117,000 riders year to date, right to the end of October. Last year we had 110,000 riders full year, so we're well ahead. Just the free transit's obviously contributed. For October alone, we're up 62% in ridership from last year, so that's significant. And Route 3, the Canmore Banff Regional Service, to which Canmore contributes 50%, ridership year to date is up 13%, and that just continues to grow. We're 167,000 riders on Route 3 to the end of October, and last year we were 169,000 riders full year. So we got a couple months to go, and the ridership is increasing, still increasing significantly, so which is great. Just move down here a bit. So the 2020 capital budget went from previously approved amount of $195,100 to update of $204,200. And that $9,100 difference is based on the cost to replace a new commission spare vehicle that we have deemed necessary. We had a number of times this summer where the commission was short a vehicle and unable to put a vehicle on the road. In fact, a couple of times over the summer, we chartered or rented the Banff Seniors shuttle bus, which doesn't meet our brand standard, so it's not the right thing to do. So it's not low floor, et cetera, and not obviously branded with Rome. So through discussions with Town of Banff Fleet Department who do our maintenance, we felt that we were short for the amount of work we're doing, and we have approval from the commission to purchase a spare shuttle bus. So it's going to be actually we have a tender out for an electric shuttle bus, which will act as a spare vehicle on a number of our routes. In the early years of the commission, like basically up till about 2016, we've had two cutaway buses, the smaller 24-passenger buses, that have been around basically for spare service and not used on routes. Now we've expanded our routes so much that those are regular buses on routes to the Cavan Basin and a route up to the Banff Centre. And so those aren't available to fill the spare capacity. And a lot of our reason for expanding those routes is to be able to share some of the administration costs across a wider range of municipalities, and with the Banff Centre, a private operator. So it's better for the commission partners as well to have more routes operating. So, and on the operating side, there are a number of areas where we've seen increases and savings, and basically when you go through both the increases and savings, we end up with about $11,000 difference. As you can see on Route 5 Canmore Local, there increased operating requisition to operate the service at the same level based on of $31,000 based on a number of different factors. We've seen the need to put in a IT systems specialist, and it's basically we have so much technology in the transit world now that we need somebody to keep it updated. We have with the fare boxes, we have the GPS tracking, we have the app where you can see where your bus is, we have security cameras, and it doesn't work anymore for our operations manager to be able to stay on top of that. So we've put an ask in for that, and this 4,700 would be Canmore Route 5's portion of that. With the
Just tell me what NSLR.
Oh, sorry, new service level request. It's so when we present our budget to the commission, we also present any new service levels over and above that, and then add them in once they're approved. And also with our increased staffing, we've gone from, in 2015, we had 12 drivers. This summer, we had 60. So it's a huge change in drivers and creates a big challenge with both recruiting and retention. And probably about 60% of our drivers are part-time. So we've implemented for next year a healthcare spending account to help both attract and retain drivers. And then, as mentioned, the commission spare bus. The $2,800 that we put in for customer service position at remote location, we are looking at putting in a customer service transit ambassadors that we started this summer, expanding that program so we're out in the community a little bit more and helping people. So it was a very successful introduction to the program this year, and we had ambassadors coming to Canmore on occasion, going out to Lake Louise, just helping riders with their questions and just promoting transit more. So it's a small portion of that cost would go to Canmore Route 5. And then vehicle expenses, we're finding we're using the vehicles more as ridership goes up. The doors open and close more. There's more mechanical breakdowns and to deal with, and then as that happens, more cost with bringing spare buses in. So there is a $12,000 increase in budget for vehicle expenses. We did also put in a $4,000 decrease in fare box revenue, just based on the results that we were getting earlier when transit was still paid in Canmore. This budget that we're still proposing has revenue in it, as the fare-free trial is only up to the end of 2019, so that's our assumption going forward. And obviously, if that changes, then we would make an adjustment to the commission budget. The CB Regional, the Canmore Banff Regional Route 3, had a requisition decrease of $27,294. And that's based on a number of factors. A lot of them, the same costs that we saw above for new things happening. And then big increases in our revenue. So $52,000 increase in budget for bus pass sales and $20,000 increase for fare box revenue. So the pass sales have been very successful, which leads to the the assumption of loyal ridership, people riding more than once, people riding regularly, whether it's to work or for recreation or shopping, whatever they choose to do, which was great to see. On the admin side, the increased operating requisition there would be $7,000. We had some assumptions in that we could offset a fair amount of our revenue by outside sources like Parks Canada contributing, and we didn't achieve the amounts that we had in the previous budget, so that's created a increase of $21,000 overall, which is split amongst the three partners, there's Canmore, Banff, and Improvement District 9. So overall, the $20,109 increase there, and then I'll talk a little bit about the ask for Route 3 increased service. Sure.
Before you move on too far, so can you remind me how that those costs are split between Canmore, Banff, and ID9? What's the formula?
Yeah, previously there was a very complicated formula as to how it was split amongst service hours. And then when we did a full review, actually Sean Krauser did a review about 3 years ago, and the formula now is an equal split on the administrative costs.
So,
And then on the operating costs, it's split by service hours to the community.
just say that again.
So the general administrative costs of running the organization are split equally 3 ways. And then on the operating costs for Route 5 that only services Canmore pays 100% of those costs. Route 3, it's equal Banff and Canmore. And then some of our other services, like the new Route 8X that goes out to Lake Louise, is split between Parks Canada and ID9.
Thanks.
So our service on Route 3, Canmore Banff Regional, currently operates, we have 2 buses dedicated to that route. One goes the full day from 6 a.m. to about 11 p.m. And then through the peak hours for commuting, we have a second bus that comes on to create 30-minute frequency. And so that's from about 6:30 in the morning until just after 9, and then from about 3 to 7 in the evening. Our ask here is to be able to fill in that gap during the day on weekdays, to have 2 buses run full-time throughout the day basically from 6 a.m. until 7 p.m. And we believe that the need is there. This summer we ended up filling the bus up on a regular basis. There was more demand than we had capacity for. And the other thing that this does is allows us to change up our schedule a little bit in the early afternoons and we're planning to go with about a 45-minute frequency. And then when we get to the peak rush hour, we're going to be on time, ready to go at 4 o'clock, 4:30. What we found last summer is with congestion in Banff and the increased ridership, we were consistently late. And that was primarily the first half of the summer. We did a couple changes that helped later in the summer. Like after 10 in the morning, we started coming in Banff Avenue instead of the Norquay entrance to avoid one train crossing, because that was part of the problem. But it's still, we still need to be able to increase our frequency to see the continued growth and maintain the loyal ridership. We had regular riders that chose not to use Rome in the summer months, and hopefully they're back on now that traffic has dropped down and we're able to stay on schedule.
Could you speak a little bit about the planning for that similar factor in Canmore, the congestion in Canmore specifically, and the perhaps reduced ridership because of that?
Yeah, we actually saw when we made the change in Canmore local service in July, we saw basically flat ridership for July and August, when you would expect to see a huge increase with free transit. And most of that was due to not being able to stay on schedule. So we're looking at, prior to next summer, we'll be looking at either small routing changes to help with that, and potentially some schedule changes to, it may be 40-minute frequency instead of 30 through those peak times to be able to stay on schedule. So we definitely recognize that there were challenges in Canmore in the summer. And that's being said, we can look at the ridership, and we're doing a full analysis right now, but we can look at the ridership in September and October and see that it's shot right back up as soon as the traffic disappears.
Yeah. Yeah, it was pretty busy in the summer months.
Yeah, so I think we recognize that, and we'll be planning for before next summer, and working with Mr. Asarte to see what else we can do, and with some of the intersection changes that will help over the long term.
So this time, you're not thinking that would have any impact on the operating budget, though?
No, not at this time, no.
Thanks.
Sorry, Martin, can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
One of the things I've heard is that the way the routes are organized, it's sort of like a big loop, right? It goes, one bus does the full, which means a couple of river crossings and 2 or 4 train crossings in 1 hour. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so the probability of being stopped at a crossing, or, do you factor that into the time, and how does that work?
We do, and we found this summer that there were more trains running, and from what we heard is more trains were running during the day because they were doing some track maintenance at night. So that did impact us. By making the change in Banff to cutting it down to only 3 train crossings, it impacted less. But on the regional route, we have 8 minutes, if everything goes perfectly, at the Banff High School stop before you leave on the next trip. So a lot of times you're pulling in there with 1 or 2 minutes or late, and that's the challenge that we have. So with this ask for additional service, we can stagger that service when we know the busy times are to a little bit longer frequency during the day. And then we really get slammed at that 4 o'clock, 4:30, 5 o'clock. So if we can start those schedules on time, we're in good shape to provide a good service. So we're rarely late in the morning. It's those afternoon for Canmore residents coming home, or the opposite for Banff people coming here.
Okay, thank you.
So just on the, I just have a graph here that, oops, see if it just kind of shows our peak times a day. It's a little bit hard to see, but you can see that where the where's the down there. Okay. Great. So you see where we have a peak in the morning, kind of that 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, and then it drops down, then starts building up again slowly around noon, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, just on that top chart. And then you get to 3, 4. So that 4 o'clock bar includes the 4 o'clock and 4:30 departures. And then 5 o'clock is still busy, and then it starts to slow down a little bit after that. So what this ask proposes is that we're utilizing existing infrastructure, so we're not asking to buy another bus, we're just asking to fill in that gap between 9:30 in the morning and 3 o'clock in the afternoon to allow us some both increased frequency during the midday and flexibility to provide a better service during the peak hours. And the anticipated cost of this is about $100,000, which is split between Banff and Canmore. So where this new service level request is at currently, it's been presented to the commission board and has the endorsement of the commission board, and now comes back to both Banff and Canmore Council for approval, and obviously both have to approve it before we can move ahead with it.
That's factored in the presentation that you provided, right?
And as far as, you've got some of the more detailed calculations here, if anybody wants to see. We factored in a very conservative 25% increase in ridership, and if it continues like everything else we've seen on the regional service, we'll surpass that, but we wanted to be conservative in our cost estimates for the first couple of years. And that's basically the ask there. Regional is going to continue to grow, and for 2021, we're looking at potentially another ask for purchasing a bus prior to the end of the Green Trip funding, so that those dollars don't go to waste, to be able to increase that frequency in 2021 with a third bus and potentially get to 20-minute frequency. So, but that's a little bit further down the road.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Are there any other questions regarding the transit? I'll go to Councillor McCallum and then Mayor Worman.
So firstly, can we get a copy of this presentation emailed to us? Because it's
Yes, definitely.
really great detail, especially if you don't sit on the Transit Commission. Secondly, can you speak a bit, Martin, to how Route 3 in its performance has allowed us to pay for fare-free transit up to this point, and what it looks for 2020?
So Route 3 has seen a surplus almost every year. We are a little bit conservative in our estimates, and we figure at some point it's going to stop growing or not grow at the same rate. But so far, we've made small tweaks to the scheduling and the routing, and it's continued growing. As I said earlier, it's at 13% year to date, which, I mean, in the transit world where you're seeing either declining ridership or very small increases, that's huge. So what that's created is a surplus each year in Route 3 that's allowed for offsetting the expenses of Route 5, the Canmore local service. Because when Canmore Route 5, the local service, even when we were charging fares, the revenues didn't come to our expectations. And part of that is because of the loyal ridership. When people are riding the bus, they were buying passes. We anticipated kind of a normal transit percentage of cash fares to passes, and we easily surpass that even in the first year of more people buying passes, which equates to less revenue overall, or more revenue overall, but less revenue per passenger that you're seeing. So Canmore Local Service has always had a shortfall, and with fare-free transit, that obviously there's not the revenue coming in. So Route 3 has helped to offset that. And we're just preparing our package for our Q3 results for this year to present to the Commission Board next week. And Route 3 again has a fairly significant surplus this year as well.
So do you think, Martin, that there'll be enough in that surplus to perhaps subsidize, if not pay for completely, fare-free transit in 2020 for Route 5?
I believe there will be. We haven't analyzed
Yeah, I know
the
you're
numbers
still in
fully.
Q3,
There
yeah.
definitely
It's trending that way possibly.
definitely there's a significant surplus that will help to pay for Route 5.
Excellent, thank you.
Just have a couple of questions. I'll be quick, but I wanted to note that in thinking back to the conversations in 2010, 11, 12, even 13, our real concern was this was going to fall flat, you know, and we weren't going to make any money. So this is a good problem to be having, too much ridership. I'm just curious if you could touch briefly on the one aspect of the BAMF funding model. I understand that they have some arrangement with the hoteliers to contribute to the operating costs. What's that look like?
We have in Banff, there's a significant hotel partnership program that allows hotels to pay a monthly fee that includes transportation for all their guests. So their guests come to the hotel, they get a 3-day transit pass. All their staff get an annual pass. And that contributes over $400,000 to the revenues for Banff Local
How
Service.
much is that?
$400,000. The difference between Canmore and Banff was a few differences, but one is the layout of the community. And Banff is a very simple transit model in that most of the hotels are on Banff Avenue. The bus runs straight down Banff Avenue and then up to the gondola. The other hotels are on either Tunnel Mountain or the Banff Springs Hotel. And the second route goes from all the Tunnel Mountain hotels and campgrounds down Banff Avenue and out to the Banff Springs. So you're getting the people, you're getting the hotel guests to their destinations. Canmore is very spread out, so we're doing a fairly long, about 14-kilometer long one-way route. And we're coming close to a few hotels, but we're not really at a point right now where we can go after hotel partners in a significant way.
Arguably, the regional service would be popular amongst hotel guests here, though, wanting to go into Banff. So that's something we can consider.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm curious about future capital acquisition plans for new buses, and I've read about the electric buses that are coming on stream in Banff. Is that sort of a general expectation of the Commission Board to make all future buses electric?
Yeah, it's not at the policy or full expectation stage yet, but it is the recommendation. It is the way a number of larger cities are going. I was at APTA, American Public Transit Association conference in New York a few weeks ago, and New York Transit is going fully electric by 2040. They're going to have, which is a fleet of 5,700 buses. They're going to have 500 electric buses within the next 4 years. So there's a huge trend that way. Electric buses are about double the cost of diesel bus, so it is a significant investment. With the two that are coming into Banff in the spring, those were purchased with Green Trip funds, and the decision was made to buy 2 electric buses rather than 4 diesel buses through the green trip funding.
Mm.
So
Well,
I do see it as a trend, but it's definitely a significant investment at this point. And the technology is moving so rapidly that you don't want to be left behind, but you also don't want to be right out in the forefront.
Well, we'll look forward to more discussion around that possibility here. And last question is just around the Cochrane on-demand model. I'm sure you're following that. Is there any sort of early analysis of how that's working?
Haven't done a real analysis, but we have been logging in. Both Steve, our operations manager, and myself have an account with the Colt system, and we log in and book buses every once in a while, then cancel them, just to see if we are able to. And it's, at times they're showing that there's no availability, and at other times they're showing availability. And from what I've seen just by that login is that you can get a bus to you within about 15 minutes, and then it gives you about a 10-minute window for pickup, so you have to be ready in that 10-minute window. And then their estimated arrival time, even if it's 3 or 4 blocks away, is 15 minutes from the time you depart. So it's very loose at this point. So we'll be watching it further and seeing how it goes. It's also, the service provider is Southland Transportation, who also provides service for us on the On-It service. So we have a little bit of insight that we'll be able to gather through them.
Great, thanks very much.
Any other questions for Mr. Bean? I did have one, and it's maybe for Mr. Sarte, and I wasn't sure, on a follow-up from Councillor McCallum's question regarding how we pay for fare-free transit. Is this where we wanted to talk about potentially some of the budget impacts of paid parking and fare-free transit, or were you going to leave that to Committee of the Whole when you do your presentation there?
I think your timing's perfect because I think that is what I have next on the agenda.
I was just looking and I wasn't certain it was, so
Oh, no, maybe not. Maybe I moved it. Sorry. But while it's relevant, we might as well.
yeah. There is the parking management implementation 2019, is that's.
to that now. It probably is a good point for that.
Anything else for Mark?
And yeah, so I think that was it for Martin then. Thanks very much, Martin,
Great.
for. Yeah.
This is a update for a 2019 project, so it isn't part of the budget amendment process. However, it is part of the larger puzzle, and so with this as a proposed item on the December 3rd agenda and having an impact to the capital budget planning, it was felt important to bring here just for a financial update. There will be a lot more detail as to what is within the budget ask, and this is really just intended to say this is coming and this is the value, so that when it comes later on December 3rd, it doesn't appear as something separate. It's being considered as part of the bigger picture. And so what we're looking at is recommendations to council that are consistent with the strategic priority of evaluating paid parking as a funding source for fare-free transit. The original project, before we started the work, had a budget of $100,000 to do some evaluation and for implementation. And we've gone out and done an RFP process and gathered costs and looked at different models. The model we're recommending on December 3rd, and we'll provide a bigger update on November 19th at COW, has a higher upfront capital investment as opposed to models that have you either leasing equipment or rent-to-own models with equipment. and has additional costs for a couple of other items. And so the overall budget increase that we will be looking at is to go for the implementation portion of that budget from $100,000 to $300,000. The funding source recommended for that is capital reserve. There is a parking cash in lieu reserve. However, this wouldn't necessarily be eligible for spending out of that. And it is possible that we look to recover capital investment through parking revenues that we would collect in the future. So it would be an upfront outlay that could be recovered if that's the choice that was made. Any of the cheaper implementation options come with longer term costs that end up with a higher overall cost picture.
So I guess this is really just to whet your appetite as, yeah, as Mr. Sarde alluded to, he's got a full presentation on the details of the system that's been selected and how it would roll out and the costs and the public information campaign that would go along with it. And that's all coming to committee of the whole meeting in November. But it is related to offsetting the costs of fare-free transit and some of the discussions we were having today with Mr. Bean here. So we just wanted to make sure that you're aware that that's still coming forward. And you'll see more details coming up. Were there any sort of high-level questions around that at this time, or shall we move on from transit and transportation, I think? We move on? Okay. Thank you very much.
So again, just as a reminder of where we started, so with our original 2020 approved budget, we were already at an approved tax increase net of growth of 4.6%. And just as a benchmark, a good reminder that we always talk about, a 1% tax increase represents about $245,000. So starting with a tax increase net of growth at 4.6% already, we didn't really have a lot of room to add much to this budget, so we really focused on how the amendments that were brought forward met the definition of that extraordinary, emergent, unexpected. Then we also received the provincial budget, which also outlined some challenging circumstances for us going forward. Administration worked very hard to balance the amendments that were proposed to initially stay within the approved tax increase of 4.6%. So in the first column there with the numbers, you can see that originally what we planned to bring forward was only a net $19,000 in terms of additional expenses, which on our overall budget of $1.5 million is really kind of rounding, and so we were able to stay at that 4.6%. However, one of the items I talked about on Tuesday was the change in the way the province is holding back more of the police fine revenue. So one of the increases we had put in was based on our 2019 police trends. We had put in an increase of $50,000 based on how our fine revenue had been tracking this year. Now with the province taking 40% instead of 23% of each ticket, we're expecting that our fine revenue will decrease by $50,000. So it kind of washes that item out. All that to say, now we're proposing $69,000 is the total of the revised operating amendments, which would be an additional 0.2% tax increase, taking us up to 4.8% net of growth.
Thank you. Could you remind me, Ms. Richardson, what was growth estimated for last year, and what do we have it estimated for this year?
We have budgeted growth at $400,000. That was the same as what we had in the 2019 original budget. Okay. The 2019 actual was $560,000. Varies from year to year. Over 13 years, the average has been about $360,000. So we've put.
So for 2020 net of growth is a $400,000 number.
$400,000 in growth, correct.
Thank you.
If there isn't anything else on the operating side, we'll again go into each one of these in detail. High level, these are the capital amendments we're proposing. Again, overall, you can see 1.7 million in total capital change, offset by there is a related item that we're recommending bringing into 2020 that's approved in 2021, so a reduction of 282,000 in 2021 because it's a related project over those 2 years. So that one had a future year impact. So starting with the first kind of bucket that I've been referring to of the items that arose as a result of council direction and priorities, one of the strategic priorities was around transportation. So just to build on Mr. Bean's presentation before, and to your point, Mayor Boroman, these are the first two items come directly from his presentation. The first item is an increase in the requisition of 20,000, and then an increase related to the regional additional service hours of 50,000. We have a couple capital items related to transportation as well. So those, the elevation place parking is page 16 of the original agenda package, and the intercept parking is page 17 in terms of the justification and more detail there. So there's the elevation place intercept parking preliminary design. We're proposing to fund that out of cash in lieu of parking. Just a reminder on what that can be used for. So cash in lieu of parking is used to fund the purchase of land suitable for future parking developments and to plan, develop, and construct parking facilities. So both of these two projects we're proposing to fund out of the cash in lieu of parking, elevation place intercept parking at 100,000 and an intercept parking site evaluation at 35,000.
Maybe we can just pause there, and are there any questions on those projects? I think we've had some good dialogue with Mr. Bean from the Commission, but the two intercept parking lot projects were ones that Mr. Sarte shared with Council at a recent Committee of the Whole meeting. And so those are being brought forward to address that priority in your strategic plan.
Yeah, I think we've had good discussion about that. I'm just curious, the cash in lieu parking reserve, is it still tracked separately from?
Yes.
So what's the balance in that reserve?
500,000.
Okay. Thanks.
I have a question. This is budgeted for 2020, these two items, the preliminary design and the intercept parking evaluation. And from those two items, we'll have a budget of what it'll actually cost to build it. But it wouldn't happen in 2020, it would happen in future budgets?
Correct.
Okay, so this is what we're committing to just for 2020. And then there will be more funds required to complete the project, right?
Yes, there will be.
Okay.
And I know there is a lot of discussion around transportation, so just to provide a bit of context for overall what's in the budget already for next year and what's been happening this year, there is a quick summary there of what we've been doing in 2019 and what is already in the approved budget for 2020 as a bit of a context for overall the transportation picture for the town, both this year and next. Next, there are some items related to environmental sustainability. So on the operating side, there is an additional 12,000 related to increased tracking expense to include the rest of our vehicle fleet, and that provides some GIS-based fleet tracking. And the intention of that is to directly use that data in the below capital item, which is to add a capital action plan initiatives project. So that's an additional 55,000 to be funded from general capital, which includes a renewable energy feasibility study and an electrical fleet feasibility study. And again, that's where that fleet tracking data would be used. So that climate action plan is page 18 of the agenda package.
And we can just pause there. Mr. Como is here and can answer questions related to these items, if there are any, regarding the operating addition for the fleet tracking or the climate action plan initiatives. And Amy Fournier was before you outlining the climate action plan priorities for 2020, and this was the budget coming out of that she indicated she would request in order to move forward those priority actions.
Just a quick question. The $50,000 or $5,000 funded by the Municipal Climate Change Action Center, that's in the bank, that's guaranteed?
Ask it again.
Oh, I just had
It's not in the bank. It would be pending approval of the grant dollars.
So we would approve that, subject to the 50% contribution?
Correct. We'd be committing $5,000 only at this point.
Okay. Do you know when we'll know that?
I don't know. It probably would be likely early in 2020.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Kamal. I just had a question for you about where we're at with GIS tracking, because we have that "Where's my snowplow" GIS thing, right?
Correct.
And I thought a few years ago we started putting GIS into our vehicles just to know what the trajectory was for the bin pickup.
Mm-hmm.
So where are we at with that part of the project, and what needs to be added?
So the old system was quite basic, to be frank, and gave us the data that you just described. So we were able to, provide data to the public about where our snowplow is and our street sweeper, as well as internally from working alone, monitor. If someone received a complaint about a vehicle speeding, we could go back and verify if that was the case or not, which incidentally is generally not. The technology continues to evolve, so that's why we've done this transition with doing more effective asset management. We have transitioned to this new system, which has been deployed to most of the vehicles, actually I believe all of the vehicles that were part of the old program through the months of October and finishing up in early November. So that's happening as we speak right now. It's a quite more involved program. Much more details is given to us, so we're going through a bit of a learning curve right now of understanding and being able to understand a lot of the details that it can provide us, like actually how we can get those details. So we're right in the process of implementing and understanding the full potential of this program as it relates to our fleet. So that's where we're at right now. The vehicles that it was largely the pickup trucks and our larger fleet were included in the transition to this new system. So this $12,000 would allow us to expand it to some of the smaller fire vehicles, facilities, and our general pool, which currently isn't part of the program.
Our general pool, as in the
vehicles
that
yes.
we use out here in the lots, that
Correct.
the council and administration use just to move around town?
Correct. Yeah, we're not looking to police council and how they drive with the vehicle, but a lot of excellent information will come out of this, which would feed this fleet feasibility study to understand what our current use is. Right now, it's very difficult when people take out a vehicle, where they go, how fast they go, where they actually go, how long it actually operates. It's very different for someone to take it and drive all the way to Edmonton and back versus to Banff and then sit for 4 hours for a meeting and drive back. Two different types of uses, possibly requiring two different types of vehicles. So this, having better data, doing this study would give us more information, better information when we were right-sizing our fleet going forward.
So are you saying we have an old system that we're upgrading?
Yes.
Yeah.
GPS, a tracking system.
GPS, okay.
Yeah.
And then adding GPS capacity to the individual vehicles?
So what we've done is we've taken a basic GPS that went to probably 2/3 of our fleet. Now we're looking to go to a more detailed, more advanced tech GPS tracking system and wishing to expand it to the entire fleet.
You can do that for $12,000?
We already had money in there.
Okay.
And with technology, things improve, but prices tend to come down too. So we're trying to take advantage of that as well.
Okay, so this is just an increase to that portion of the budget?
To expand it to the entire fleet.
Okay, great. All right, thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Como on that group of projects? Okay, great.
Similarly, within the package, I'm not going to speak to this too much, but in light of the emphasis on environmental sustainability lately, I did want to highlight that while those are the amendments that are related to the environmental sustainability initiatives, there is, again, a lot we're doing in 2019 and other projects that are already approved within 2020. So within 2019, we had the whole organics program, and we know interest in that program has been quite strong. There's also some solar projects already in 2020. The next one I was going to speak about was some amendments related to wildlife coexistence. So a capital project for a coexistence near wildlife initiatives projects increase. So we did have an approved project in 2020 for $50,000. We're now asking for another $20,000 to bring the total budget for up to $70,000. That is intended to cover these 4 projects. So the Quarry Lake Dog Park signage, some social norms implementation, and some fruit tree removal plans.
And we'll pause there. This is also in Mr. Como's area. If there are other questions related to these projects, the details are in attached sheets, but which you got in there, Mr. Mayor Borman?
If we want to just talk about it now and not later. Yes. So just the boundary delineation. So from the report, I understand that initially we were talking about some sort of cable fencing or something, but it sounds like that's not the direction now. It's more using boulders and whatnot to delineate the area. Is that correct?
We have not landed on exactly what we're going to use to make that line clear to the public. So it could still be a cable and post, maybe even some sections. It could be rocks in other sections. It could be one or the other exclusively. We haven't finalized that yet. What we need to do is ensure that we work with bylaw services so that when we draw those lines, that it's much easier for them to be able to enforce.
Right.
So we haven't landed on one or the other yet.
And that was sort of the question I had when I read the report. The way it was described in the report, my question was, this is adequate for bylaw? I mean, they feel if it rolls out as described in the report, they would have the confidence to then issue tickets up there?
Yes, they've been involved with the process from the beginning, and so their feedback is critical. And so it will, whatever they require to make sure that they can enforce is what we're going to deliver.
Great. Go ahead.
So just on that, with the signage, that's included in that boundary delineation, what kind of signage? I've seen all kinds of different signage up there, from permanent to temporary. Are you planning to expand the temporary signage, which is sort of coroplast or something similar? I just wonder what you know so far about the signage that you need there.
Is it making a distinction between temporary and permanent?
Yeah, because there seems to be, well, I haven't been up there for a while, I have to admit, but it seemed to me there was some more temporary stuff that was sort of the coroplast, and but it was really good. The graphics were great, and it was really clear. So I just wondered if, having had that temporary signage, if now you're going to move to permanent signage, because you know what works and what doesn't.
Exactly. Because it has been in a pilot for the last 3 years, that's why we've used temporary signage. It's much cheaper to fabricate. So going forward, if we get approval and this is the direction we're headed, we're going to formalize it with permanent signage, matching similar graphics and images so that we can ensure we're being effective.
Okay, thank you.
Just sort of unrelated, but reminded me, so seeing the bit about the fruit tree removal and all, the movable sign that's at the bottom of the hill going up to Three Sisters now, I wonder if we could reword it so it's not quite so polite. It's like, it says, please remove fruit from tree. It's not be quite so, I would say, remove fruit from tree or face a fine. We're trying to be clear with the public that this is just a thought.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah.
For me, who uses the dog park regularly, I think the important piece to be clear about is that there will be 2 distinct off-leash areas connected by an on-leash pathway. And that's caused confusion, and people have been walking their dogs off-leash between the 2 areas, and that's been allowed. It's been difficult to enforce. So the real concept is to create an off-leash area in the big open space, an off-leash area by the pond, and in between, all the areas around are on-leash.
But isn't there at the dog pond also a concern or an issue of dogs staying within the off-leash area?
That's always been a concern, and it's your job as a dog owner to keep your dog in that
Right.
off-leash.
So this proposal would refine that?
Yes, but it will not contain dogs. It's not a
No,
full
it
fenced.
creates a clear point where the
Yes.
bylaw can say you're outside of.
Exactly, yeah.
That was my question too, about the dog park. From the diagram, it looks like, as Lisa said, there's an on-leash area, and then you leave the off-leash area, then you leave the off-leash area into an on-leash area, and then you enter into another off-leash area? So
Yes.
there's pathways between 2 off-leash areas. But there's no containment of those 2 off-leash areas, because currently our off-leash parks have fencing, double entry gates. It's very, very obvious where it begins and ends, because your dog can't get out. So in a situation like this, where your dog can virtually run between the boulders and get out, how are you going to exert a fine if your dog escapes the non-enclosure of an off-leash area?
One of the really important conditions of using a off-leash dog park is having control of your dog. So the dog owner is ultimately responsible for making sure their dogs behave, both based on how they approach others, other dogs, and staying within the confined space. It was much easier to do a fenced area within more of the urban footprint to be more clear, especially because we are closer to people's homes and playgrounds and so on, so it was very imperative that we did that. Here, this is a very different circumstance because it is adjacent and through a wildlife corridor. We needed to allow, make sure we didn't have inhibitants for wildlife moving through there as well. So that's why we've opted to go with this direction that allows wildlife to move through there, but also making sure that, and emphasizing the dog owners are ultimately responsible for their dog's behavior and where they go.
So is there going to be any seasonal change to the pattern? Or is it always going to be on off-leash, with an on-leash section between, even in the winter?
There's no plan to make changes for the season. It will be like that full-time.
Okay. What I've heard from dog owners who walk their dogs in there, I don't have a dog, but I've been in there, is that the cyclists come through the on-leash or off-leash area, and there's a bit of a bottleneck right beside the dog pond. So is there I see you've got some sort of a gate or showing that you're leaving the off-leash area around that dog pond. So will there be some sort of communication to the cyclists that they're now entering a place where there's going to be a fair concentration of off-leash animals if we're going to concentrate them into that area? So I think there's just an uncomfortable interface between the 2 user groups right now.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. To be honest, that has not something we've considered, but we can certainly look at that to advise people entering.
Because there will be a gated, some sort of.
It's not going to be a gate. It would
Well, it's an opening.
It would be an opening, yes.
Yeah. But not a closed gate, but an opening between those 2 very distinct areas, right?
That's right. Yeah,
I would certainly echo that. There's a lot of conflict between cyclists and off-leash dogs there. It's not a good co-use, having cyclists go through the off-leash area. So if at all possible, if cyclists could be somehow encouraged to go around the off-leash area through signage or just talking to the youth, it's mostly organized. Well, no, I guess there's informal, but there's a lot of camps, kids' camps, that go out of that area, and there'll be 20 cyclists going through at once, and it's a high conflict zone.
I had another question about the Town of Canmore fruit tree removal program. A few years ago, we did that, excuse me, project where we identified all of our municipal reserve lands because we were considering them for potential housing projects, right? Do you remember that? Where we,
Planning would have done that.
So just to clarify, it wasn't municipal reserve. We looked at all town-owned parcels, but it
All
was also
town-owned
looking at provincially owned parcels and privately owned parcels that had a potential for future housing developments. But it wasn't specific to MR.
we ended up with a solution to some of our housing issues, but we did do a sort of an inventory of what was available for that. So is that something that you can actually use as a desktop of where the tree removal program would be required because we know what is town-owned land?
We already know what just the virtue of our GIS system, we know where all of our town land is. What tends to be a problem is where on the ground to determine where that line actually is where it's difficult. So if you were to go where an MR is and you were to see a fruit tree, you don't, short of looking for the pins, you wouldn't be able to say for sure if it's been something that the adjacent homeowner has planted or that is actually on town land. So even that study we did a few years ago where we identified all the fruit trees or the tractants, we don't actually know where they are, like where the trees are that would be of town responsibility.
Did the town ever actually plant fruit trees other than the ones out here?
No.
Like, did the town
No.
actually ever plant apple trees in any of our municipal?
I don't
lands?
believe we have. How we could possibly have apple or fruit-bearing trees on municipal lands is where someone has encroached and they have planted unknowingly or knowingly, or where we've taken MR land that has been developed into a park from a developer. Those would really be the two big ones. Other than where we've done building expansion, I don't believe we obviously have planted some fruit-bearing trees in those scenarios.
But it's not common for us to plant fruit-bearing trees in our own parks, right?
Not outside of a building
Yeah, not outside of a building.
property, no.
Right, okay. So that sounds like a fairly major project if we're planning $10,000. Does that include the removal of the trees or just the identification, or both?
It's a blend. We'll also be looking at the high priority areas, so out in Three Sisters, Quarry Lake peaks, where we have been told those are the problematic areas, we'll be looking at removing trees as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's identifying and removal,
Okay.
but not all the removal.
Thanks.
Just follow up to that, I recall from the presentation at council around these plans that it's fairly pricey to have the tree removed.
Okay.
So $10,000 may sound like a lot of money, but that may not remove a lot of trees each year. Is that a reasonable assumption?
Yes, this will just begin the project. So, this is an amendment to 2020. I know this is important to council and the community, so we will likely be proposing monies in 2021 and perhaps even the year after that to be able to complete the project on municipal lands.
So further to that, I know that, are we talking to developers about what they do? I know we have a list of plants and trees that are not recommended, but it's more of a guideline than a regulation. So where does that sit? Because if we're busy taking out trees and new trees are being planted in new areas, it seems like a bit of there's a word for that, but I can't think of it right now. I was trying to think of something more polite, but I can't come up with it. But it seems sort of fruitless, if you will.
Fruitless.
Well done.
Yeah, no, that's a tricky point as we I would say, I would call this a transition from moving away from permitting. I mean, people are still allowed to have them right now, they just need to go out and ensure that the fruit is removed, you know, to Mayor Borman's point about the sign and changing the language. Because people are still permitted to have those trees, and so people could continue to plant those trees. If they are concerned about wildlife and really being able to see this is the direction the community is going, my hope is that they would not be spending that money on a tree that attracts wildlife and something more natural and native.
And if people go to planning or parks and ask for a list of sanctioned plants or trees, can they get such thing?
Yeah, the engineering and design guidelines has a list of native species that we encourage people to use.
Okay, thanks.
And I think I remember from that conversation that we had that they were going to update the landscaping requirements in the urban design guidelines?
Yeah, that's correct. The new engineering design guidelines will be coming forward for your first peek, I think, at the Committee of the Whole in November, and I believe it includes an updated species list. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the landscaping will be included in that, so you can ask more questions.
Okay, so we can sort of nip that in the bud.
Yeah. But appreciate that they're guidelines. Yeah.
We'll get to the root of the problem.
Okay, moving along. Any more questions? Okay. Seeing none, we'll move along.
So these next two, Mike, sorry. These next two are also related to council direction we've received, but not necessarily the 6 strategic priorities as outlined. So the first relates to overnight parking on municipal lots. This was an item that was brought forward, and now we've attached a dollar value to it. So we're proposing $110,000 as broken out below, related to enforcement, program administration, materials and supplies, and other miscellaneous costs. And then a capital item for an adaptive seat swing to be installed at Centennial Park for $52,000, and that's capital funded through general capital.
And again, I'll just pause here, and maybe Dr. Cottle, you can speak to the overnight parking and what the plan for bringing a recommendation.
Sure thing. So right now, staff are working. In fact, Travis's last day is tomorrow. And he's working on trying to get this program as set up as possible, and then Lisa Brown and her team will finalize it. It's on the tentative agenda right now for council in January. So this budget amount are really just rough numbers and big buckets. In January, this number will be refined and council will be asked to approve the entire project. So in large part, this is a placeholder. That number may change, or council may have a variety of options to approve that could change this number, but we did think through this process that it was important to indicate that we knew this program was coming and would have some impact. So we don't really have many specifics, but we did want to put in some big buckets and a rough number. Early in the year, you should expect to have it in front of you.
Okay, questions on that? And then the adaptive seat swing was an initiative Councillor McCallum requested and has been priced out and is proposed for the Centennial Park area. And there's some details in your full package on that. Okay, moving on then.
One last item. This item is operating but doesn't have any tax impact, mostly behind the scenes, but late in the budget process, we did move the sustainability expenses, but only the salaries, wages, and benefits portion from planning to public works, just where those monies went. But there are some remaining sustainable expenses that are still sitting in planning, so this is mainly just cleaning that up and ensuring they're all in the same location. There aren't any questions on that one. Then the next group of items we wanted to talk about are items that are more uncontrolled third-party costs. So there are 3 here related to operating. The first is an increase in the Canmore Rec Center custodial services. Looking at a new contract there after the renovations. So there's an additional $55,000 there. We're also looking at increase in power expenses, and this was something that was brought to our attention kind of late in the budget process last time as well. This isn't necessarily a surprise, but we are experiencing an increase mainly in the transmission and distribution charges. So that's anticipated to have an impact of $107,000. And then finally, we received a letter from CCHC around their requisition and the PAH taxes we collect. So there is the opportunity to reduce the operating portion for them by $25,000, and accordingly the taxes we collect on their behalf.
And so I did want to pause there on that one especially. Certainly could take any questions on the increase in power cost and custodial services as well. But specifically the CCHC requisition, that was discussed at the shareholders meeting, and council indicated they would discuss it at the finance committee meeting as to whether or not it was your intent and desire to completely reduce the requisition overall by that $25,000, or keep the requisition the same and move $25,000 more into reserve. CCHC says they don't need it for their administrative operating requirements, but it would be up to council. At this point in time, administration is recommending that you reduce the requisition, but we did want to make sure that you do that intentionally. And Mayor Borman?
And that was really the intent of the board in the conversations, was to slowly, or at least finally, begin to reduce the dependency of the Housing Corporation on the town's tax collection. So that was the intent. It's not a large amount of money, but it's a beginning. So yeah, that's the expectation.
And maybe I just have a question of clarity for yourself and Councillor Hillstead that sit on the board. Was it clear that if you let these funds go, these $25,000, that it would be an additional ask if you needed to bring them back in the following year? I was wondering if there was discussion about moving them into reserve in case this reduction wasn't a sustainable reduction?
Yeah. Well, my recollection of the conversation and more recent reports is the reserves are healthy, and there wasn't any concern voiced about the immediate future in any case. I don't recall if anybody actually said, oh, by the way, if you want to bump that back up, you're going to have to ask for it. I think the general sense of the board is that with the increased number of units that are contributing, we as the board can reduce our dependency on town tax collection.
Okay, Councillor McKellen?
So when you mean by doubling, not only is it, you'd have to come back and ask for that $25,000, but that actually would be $50,000. Doesn't it double up because you're looking on catching up for 2 years then, in terms of what an increase looks like, or am I thinking of a different calculation?
Well, if they just needed the $25,000 back, then it would just be the $25,000 that
Okay.
have to come back in. But no, you're correct. If they
Okay,
wanted,
thank you.
because we're reducing it from 450 to 425,
But if they wanted the,
475 to 450. So if they wanted to go
Just additional 25.
just an additional
Okay.
25, but if they, yeah, okay,
Okay.
it's just an additional 25.
Because the 250,000 straight to the reserve is because it was a fixed amount. We just put in everything.
Okay.
So the intent at this point from admin is to recognize that change through a reduction of tax demand?
Correct, yeah. And if council wished to do anything different, when the motions come forward, you would have to make that amendment at the motions. Okay?
Some further third-party costs, well, not third-party, but not necessarily controlled directly by us, both payroll-related. So we are proposing to increase the salary, wages, and benefits slippage up to $700,000 from the $500,000 we currently have in our budget. It's always a bit of an estimate, but we're proposing this increase based on a 6-year trend of about 3.4%. So we've calculated that 3.4% that we have historically experienced over the past 6 years against our proposed 2020 budget amount in that line item, which would indicate that slippage might be closer to 700,000 than 5. A trend is just that. There is some variance, but that is our best estimate potentially at this point in time. The next item relates to our COLAs. So at the time the budget was approved, we had estimated it at 2.5%, but per the budget guidelines, we use the Calgary CPI rate, and that's actually decreased. So it's sitting at about 2%, so that's also a reduction.
Just a question about slippage and the trend. I want to say that in my first or second year on council, slippage was calculated at $100,000 at that point, and every year it's increased more and more. Does this show a continued trend in the town being unable to get staff to fill positions based on the nature of our community?
I wouldn't say necessarily. I think as our organization grows, the number of positions we have grows, there is a certain amount of, maybe for lack of a better word, natural turnover that happens. And we know that there's always, recruiting lag. Then while we post that position, we do our best to expedite, is that the right word? That process. And when possible, we do try to backfill. So this isn't intentional in any way on our part. I think it's just
I'm not
innate.
implying whatsoever that it's intentional. I'm just trying to see if I guess highlighting maybe an issue in recruitment, not that the jobs are bad to fill, it's just that it's difficult to recruit because of probably the expense of our community. So.
And I haven't heard that directly from Human Resources. I think the trends that we're seeing is more just
trends.
as our organization grows and we have more positions, that amount that relates to that lag and just, again, for lack of a better word, that kind of natural turnover that happens in any organization just becomes more and more monetarily significant.
Okay, thank you.
I had a similar question for Therese from Ms. Rogers. A month or two ago when we had a lot of positions out there being advertised, and I said, should we be worried? What does this mean? And she did a little research, I guess, and reassured me afterwards that, as Chelsea noted, the size of the corporation is just, so the percentage of positions that we had to fill, many of which were low entry-level positions, was pretty typical for other municipal corporations our size. So I think that's what it is.
All right, thank you very much.
Can I just ask another question along that same line? Does that put stress on the organization when we have or do we have enough staff and backfill positions, as you said, to cover that slippage?
Do you want me to
Sure.
answer? I can. So it is stressful whenever a position is gone, and we are pretty good at backfilling, especially in the operational areas, because those positions need to be filled. If we lose, somebody on a solid waste services truck, for example, it's important that we backfill as soon as possible. But when we, lose a general manager, and it takes a while, we were very proactive and Michael Fark had given a long lead time, so we were able to recruit and have that position filled quite quickly. But there is stress overall, absolutely, in the organization when positions are vacant. And we are working, one of the human resource team's objectives moving forward is to shorten the duration of time that positions stay vacant. So we are trying to close that gap. It's longer than we would like right now. I think it's an average of 12 weeks that when somebody vacates a position before we have somebody fully on and replacing that person is 12 weeks. And that's quite a long time, and we want to try to shorten that. So we're changing some of our recruitment processes to bring them into the departments, for example. We do have high turnover in some of the recreation areas and in some of the facilities departments, for example. And we're moving to allow those departments to recruit in a more proactive fashion. Yeah.
Add to that too, I agree with everything that Ms. DeSoto has said. And in some departments, like we saw in the last year in bylaw, we can't really backfill because of certification and qualifications. And so at those times, then we have things like we saw this year with reduced service levels, where offices just aren't closed or there's no one available to take a phone call, which we managed fine, but it's fairly stressful to staff to be in that kind of circumstance. So, yeah.
And when we say backfill, is that within the organization, or is that a paid position that we actually bring in for a short period of time?
It can be both. Sort of depends on the nature of the position. So sometimes the backfill is that we hire a temporary employee, or other times maybe there's somebody who is currently working part-time for us, and because they know it's going to be a month or two, they increase their hours to help cover. You know, we try to do that. There's a variety of ways that we can do that kind of backfill. So, and sometimes it just depends on the circumstance of who's gone, you know, and what the nature of the work is.
Okay, great, thank you.
Any further questions on either of those items? If not, I'll move along. So that covers the operating portion of the third-party costs. Next up is a capital item related to, again, the TIP 20 project, as we've been speaking about. This particular item pertains to an increase related to the deep utilities. So this is an additional 1.2 million that we're proposing funding through debt.
And I guess this is just as good a place as any to maybe take a break, because what I was thinking is Mr. Como could come up and speak to this one, but there might be a number of questions on this, as it's a large capital project increase. So why don't we take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and start with this one.
So I'm just pulling up a plan up onto the screen here that provides more detail as to what, turn it on. Is that clear? Okay. So what I have up here is our current drawing for alignment and work that is scheduled to be done next year. And what you see up here is the intersection with A and W. So just for reference, this here is the A and W right here. And right here we have the railroad tracks. So when we had originally proposed the project, there was, as we learned with Lift Station 2 upgrade, a miss on being aware of identifying the risks and contingency associated with groundwater, and we didn't really talk about the method of construction. So I think at the time the consultant had just assumed open cut, which is much less expensive than micro drilling, which is part of what we did for Lift Station 2. We found it to be very effective, especially in and around groundwater, and we looked at considering using the same type of technology for how we were going to go underneath the railroad tracks. You can imagine open excavating under railroad tracks would be very, very disruptive. So we wanted to utilize that system where it was appropriate, and then open excavate and save monies outside of that area of work. So what we're looking to do, right here where my finger is where the Lift Station 2 project ended, where we added in that new caisson where we ran the micro drilling machine. So the idea is to continue that capacity upgrade underneath the railroad track. So this is that micro tunneling, the orange line that you see. The red line is a current sanitary line that, if you look, it continues up like that. We're looking to abandon that old sanitary line and put a water main inside of it, because it already has a structural crossing in there. So it's not that we're going to clean out the pipe and start running potable water through it. We're actually going to put a new pipe inside of it, to be clear. And then from there, if we just talk about the water side, is then once we're on the other side of the tracks, open excavate across here and just continue running across the intersection and across. And there's an existing water line here that's dotted, and we would just tie it in right there. On the sanitary side, after we've crossed the railroad line, to save money, we would open excavate right through the middle of the intersection across to the other side where Blondie's is right now, and then head north towards the hospital. So at this point, the project we're not looking to change the scope in any respects. The idea is to, we've taken the project to 90% detailed design, so really looking at the most appropriate type of construction method, the most appropriate alignment, and based on that, we've had it priced out again, and that's what we've determined or learned, is that the price that we currently have is not adequate, and that's why we need the additional $1.2 million to allow the project to continue as part of the TIP 20 in 2020.
There are questions on that? Councillor Mara?
I have a question. Because we're going under the rail, is there any chance of getting money from CP Rail because we're not disturbing their, okay. No?
It's probably
Just
quite
being naive, Okay.
It's probably quite the opposite. If we were to create disruptions from them, they would come
They would come
to
just
us.
curious.
Yeah.
Looking
Because
for, just looking.
Yeah, fair question. It's their right away. Yeah.
Well, there's always, all they can say is no.
Nothing to lose.
So I had a question. What part of what you're showing us here is now complete?
Is now
Is
complete?
Yeah. What part is-
None of the, so anything colored is what is the work that's going to happen next year. The work that we finished this fall with Lift Station 2 upgrade finishes right here. So
Okay.
that drill went from here towards the lift station.
Oh, okay. So we have experience with that micro drilling, and it worked out well for you?
Yes, we were very pleased. It's just expensive, but we were very pleased with how well it worked, especially in high groundwater conditions.
Okay. So what you're showing us here is both lines are the proposed work for that 1.2 million?
Correct, not
The
work that
orange.
happened this year.
Okay, great.
And I want to be clear, it's not 1.2 million, that's a 1.2 million increase to a $1.4 million
Right.
budget. So
Sorry,
the full
yeah.
budget for this project is now increased to 2.6 million. It's almost a doubling of the budget.
Right.
And it's only because we're adding that level of complexity by micro drilling as opposed to open trench drilling?
I would say it's a combination of the micro drilling as well as the miss, I believe, in around groundwater, managing groundwater.
Right.
Because we'll still have to do groundwater out here as, I mean, it improves as we go farther north, but there is still groundwater conditions we'll have to manage within the intersection.
But you can do that part of it with open trench because it's less,
Yes,
Of an
we're
issue?
just farther, it's just the water's farther down.
thank you.
Just in regards to the additional 1.2 debenture, and thinking about the conversation just this week, wasn't it? About the direction within the debt policy around keeping the debt below the, how's it worded, the 50% in the retiring in 10 years or something. There was a ceiling on that. Don't remember the section number, but Chelsea, you referenced it in your presentation the other day.
Yeah, as part of the debt policy, I don't have the number in front of me, is percentage debt maturing within 10 years.
Yeah.
And the policy provision is less than 50%. We were at 16 before this, so it was still well
Still
well
lots of
below.
room, okay?
Yeah.
And later on, I'll get into the percentage of our debt limit we're at, as well as our debt
Right.
servicing limit. Our target was 70%.
Great, thanks.
Okay, are there any other questions for Mr. Como on that project?
So not really, but it's kind of intriguing that you're reusing old infrastructure in the way you are with the shooting another pipe up. Is that done anywhere, or has it been done in Canmore, or is that becoming a trend, or?
Well, there's two ways we can do it, and this is kind of unique that we're changing from a sanitary to a water line. But we have done sections where we've relined an existing sanitary line. That's a
Right.
little bit more common. If the
Yeah.
pipe doesn't have a major shift, you can do that.
Yeah. How old is the sanitary line there?
We have a mix of stuff from the 60s and 90s in here.
Oh, okay. Great, good.
Okay, moving on then.
So another item that is capital in nature that we're putting in this third-party cost category is an increase in budget for our Rocktopia wall replacement. The budget was formerly $80,000, and now the amendment is for an additional $15,000 to bring the total budget for the project up to $95,000. This is page 30 of your agenda package. There's a little more information there. Overall, we received an increased cost estimate back in September. The main factors are the actual supply cost increase and also the US-Canadian exchange rate right now.
Mayor
Any-
Borman, did you have a question or, no? Any questions on that one?
Last couple of operating items, again, no tax impact because one is handled through a reserve transfer. The other is, again, just a transfer, this time within a department, but between two line items. The first is $53,000, which is the increase in power expenses that relates to the water utility. You may recall previously we talked about the impact of the increased power expense on our municipal offices, our buildings. This is the portion that pertains to the water utility. So that's done through the reserve transfer, so no tax impact there. Additionally, there's a change within engineering with regards to certain tasks that were done by previously an employee that now we're expecting to have more done externally. So that's a transfer from salaries and wages and benefits to professional services for $45,000. Any questions around either of those items?
On this chart in the package, are those combined under the Water Utility Service Agreement Review? Is that something different?
That's a different item that we'll get
Okay.
to later in the presentation. If that's it for that one, then that kind of takes us to the end of the third-party costs and into some items that we're bringing forward internally. The first one relates to the addition of in-house legal counsel. There was a business case for this attached within the agenda package that starts on page 11. So the operating impacts of that would be the addition of that legal in-house counsel, so salaries, wages, benefits for that position, related costs at $170,000, and then a corresponding reduction in our legal expense related to having that expertise in-house. We're anticipating a reduction of $150,000 in that category for a net change of $20,000.
I'll just come up here because this was an item that I was going to speak to but certainly open to just going directly to questions. As a corporate strategic team earlier in 2019, this was one of the items we committed to looking at. I believe Council's well aware that our former General Manager of Municipal Infrastructure had some legal background and capacity that he had just picked up through the organization and was essentially acting as a legal advisor for us in many portfolios and files. And it just was routinely taking him away from his core duties. So in addition to sort of the external counsel role, we also no longer have that capacity in the organization, and nor was it ever an explicit part of that job requirement. It was just something that we were able to capitalize on because of the expertise that the former GM had. So we believe we're at that critical juncture in our organization where the complexity of the issues we're dealing with and the volume of the issues we're dealing with need to be better managed from an overall risk mitigation perspective. I did want to draw your attention to the cost analysis that's on page 15 of your agenda package. And, you know, you'll see that there's a list of 2017, 2018, and year-to-date 2019 expenditures, and we've put them into the various buckets of contracts and agreements, bylaw reviews and prosecutions, planning reviews and advice. There's also HR matters and litigation. And the lion's share of the work there, we believe, can be completed by in-house legal counsel if we moved it in-house. Certainly some specialty files, whether that's in planning, litigation, and the occasional HR matter, might also require external counsel advice. And if we get into litigation, certainly we would be using external counsel. And then the proposed budget, the second part of that cost analysis, is just looking at transferring the currently budgeted external costs of $150,000 for legal into the salary, wages, and benefits for in-house counsel. And while it would cost more overall, we would be monitoring and reporting on that. We think for the additional $20,000, that it's certainly beneficial to move in this direction. Mayor Borman, any questions on that?
So just thinking about recent experience and appreciating that to some extent at least we contracted some of our legal to Osler for their planning expertise. My expectation, I guess, would be if we had in-house legal, clearly one of the skills would be, or one of the areas of expertise we'd be looking for is in planning issues. But some of our planning issues are complex, so I would also expect that we would continue to work with Osler on some of those issues.
And that it would be decided on an issue-by-issue basis.
Right.
We would be looking for a generalist, just to be clear, not a specialist in planning law. The generalist would be able to address all of our routine issues around contracts and agreements and bylaw prosecutions and bylaw issues and help with the crafting of those documents up front.
Mm-hmm.
They would also be case managing all of our legal files. So currently our legal files are really, they're managed by a myriad of different people in the organization. But by centralizing them with in-house legal counsel, there would be an oversight and a risk framework approach that we currently don't have.
So under the proposal, there would be $35,000 left in the budget for professional fees that might include other legal.
It wouldn't be dedicated to legal. We use that budget
Right.
to bring in external consultants, facilitators, those kinds of things. But yes, we would have $35,000 available that we could use for external
I
counsel.
guess the thrust of my question is around, I think that could be used up pretty quickly, and given certain circumstances, if we really have to depend on a firm like Osler, that $35,000 could go really quickly, don't you think?
I would, if we're into litigation, it could go quickly. Yes.
Not that I plan to get into litigation, you
No.
understand. But I'm just, I guess the question is that enough of a buffer over, if it's 170 for in-house, is another 35 for the professional fees still adequate, or are we gonna, are you gonna have to come to council mid-year and say, I need another 40,000 or something?
We currently believe it's a sufficient buffer. If you look at the history of our organization, the $150,000 has been, in fact, a few years ago, we actually reduced that legal budget to $100,000, and then it went back up when we had some complexities with land use issues.
Okay.
So we believe it's sufficient currently. Yes, Councillor Comfort?
I'm sort of in that vein, I have a question. When you hire a firm and they assign you a lawyer or a couple of lawyers to deal with whatever the issue is, if you have an in-house lawyer, that individual lacks that backup or expertise. And I'm just wondering, was there any discussion on that issue?
Just on you're very correct in that the value of a firm is you have the big backing of the firm behind them. One of the cons of external counsel is you're constantly paying to bring them up to speed on your issue. So, just an initiation meeting on your issue can be an hour or two or more of a lawyer's time, whereas having in-house counsel here and well aware of the issues, participating in the corporate strategic team meetings, and they'd be up to speed. But I think your question is just about back up. So we would have to use external counsel for issues that are more complex, or that the in-house counsel might need some advice on, but it would be, I think, a much less cost than if we were strictly just going to external counsel, because they'd be able to do a bunch of the research, for example, in-house. A lot of what we've experienced is we end up talking on the phone with a senior lawyer, but a lot of the work gets done by junior lawyers. And it's all research and case law investigation, et cetera, and we get a full legal opinion that's been put together by an articling student, reviewed by the senior partner or whatever. So, we might be able to do all of that case review and research ourselves, and then potentially just have a quick check-in with a senior partner at Osler, for example.
And so I also know that it varies year to year depending on who's coming after us or what the issues are. And so I presume, would we have like an annual evaluation of these monies and then say, spread it out over a 10-year period to see if it's, because I wouldn't anticipate saving any money here.
No, we don't anticipate.
The same service or better for probably slightly more money.
Absolutely, that's how we would summarize it as well. We think we would be better served, potentially broaden the scope to include sort of that enterprise risk management function that we don't have in-house. But yeah, there isn't a proposed cost savings. We just are adding significant value for a minor cost increase.
And so, yeah, so it's keeping the money at home rather than sending it to Calgary and Edmonton or wherever else we deem the expertise to be, I think.
That's another way of putting it, for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Berman or Councillor McCallum, did you have a question?
Yes,
yeah.
I did. So you just articulated how work is done when we call Osler or whatever, that a junior lawyer is, or an articling student. So what caliber of lawyer are we going to be looking at hiring? A mid-career lawyer, beginning career lawyer?
Yeah, and
I just look at this number and I don't really feel like it's like this person's going to need an assistant. So how is that number going to cover, like I just think about what lawyers do, and even just a lawyer here in town that just deals with real estate transactions. They're not one-man shows. Mm-hmm. So
that is a fair point. We did add capacity in the executive office admin assistant role. Was that just this year, 2019? Just this year. In fact, the person we added there has a bit of a paralegal background, so there is some advantage to that, and I believe there is some capacity within our executive office admin assistant team to support in-house counsel as well. What I haven't done is to look at external counsel and ask them how much their admin team does. We are lean, and I know folks like Whitney and others who join our team from larger organizations often find that we don't have a significant amount of admin capacity that is typically available in larger organizations. So that is something that we're going to potentially start to see across the organization. I don't know if this is the tipping point.
that's what I'm trying to figure out, is where's the tipping point? And I'm not sure, I'm not 100% sold on the fact that we're there yet.
Because if you look at
we're
our
close,
finance
but I
department,
don't
for
think we're
example,
there.
our finance department, our HR department, our IT department, no admin support.
Mm-hmm.
And as those departments grow, you then have to start to look at, are you paying a manager of finance to photocopy or put finance packages together, right?
Are we going to be paying a lawyer to photocopy?
Right, and that's
that's my
certainly not our
question.
intent, and no. We believe we have the executive office admin support, and that in-house counsel would report to me and would be part of the corporate strategic team and have that executive office
And
support.
so how many hours on average do you expect that admin support would be available to the legal counsel if they're in-house? 10 hours a
Yeah.
week? 5 hours a week?
I can't honestly
Yeah.
say that I've done that analysis.
Because I feel like we hired that person in the executive office for a different function than supporting a future lawyer in our office. And so that's what I don't want to see, that robbed from the functions that we'd already had planned for that individual, or for that role, rather. Anyways,
That's
it's
fair.
an
Yep.
interesting, it's an interesting proposal, and I can see, I wasn't necessarily shocked when it came forward, but I still have a lot of questions, and I'm not sold necessarily that we're there yet. I feel like we're gonna still need more legal counsel, and it might be, even though we have to spend all that time bringing lawyers up to speed, I think that's just gonna be the nature of the beast for a while, but we'll see what the rest of everybody else says.
Yep, no,
Who knows?
that's fair. Councillor Seeley?
I'm wondering if this position would add oversight to the SDAB and Canmore Planning Commission?
Certainly, that's another function, yes, that we were considering. And as you're aware, or I believe you're aware, if you're sitting on those committees or boards, that we've been starting to consider bringing in external counsel, or at least having external counsel on standby for phone-ins if needed during those sessions. So that's something we were looking at if we didn't have this capacity in-house.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Borman?
Contrast to Councilor McCallum, I do think we're there now. One of the experiences that I have fairly regularly is wishing that I could just say to somebody, well, what do you think? What's looking for legal advice? And you know, I don't do it very often because it costs a lot of money. I recognize, I think we all recognize that finding the right person with the right skill set, willing to work in that sort of a position at the rate that we're suggesting is a challenge, and that's certainly identified as one of the risks. But just for the sake of the discussion, I wondered if you could expand a little bit on what you've talked about in section 6 around noting that typically communities our size don't have in-house, but the complexity of legal issues in Canmore makes bringing counsel in-house a viable recommendation. And I think I have a pretty solid understanding of what you have in mind about the complexity of legal issues in Canmore. But do you want to just expand on that a little bit?
It's mostly around our land use issues. And when we did poll other communities and looked at budgets, our legal budget is higher than most communities our size. So that was one factor, and a reason why communities our size are not bringing it in-house, because they just haven't reached that threshold yet. So that's specifically what we're
Right.
talking about. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so land use is pretty much the
Land
complexity.
use is, but there's also the volume of contracts and there's an overall volume, I guess, of work in the big buckets that we identified there: contracts, agreements, bylaws, planning, HR. You know, and certainly contracts, agreements, and HR matters and bylaws are common in all municipalities, and those are a lot of what gets done in the routine rote work. And we think we could be well served by in-house counsel for all those costs. Ms. Smithers?
If I can just add, in my own experience working in planning in municipal settings, a lot of time the land use issues are really related to interpretation and application of the entire regulation, right? So I think that that's where the in-house legal counsel for the municipality, the knowledge of the MGA and interpretation of the regulation that we're required to work underneath there's a benefit there that, yes, is absolutely critical for planning, because a lot of time it's about proper application of the regulation and how that informs municipal bylaws and policies and the rest of it. But that knowledge base it goes well beyond planning. I think planning's kind of the most visible manifestation of the regulation, but the skill set is still there required across the municipality. And I think, to me, that's a lot of the benefit. And it also ties into Mr. Soto's comment about integrated risk management and an eye to managing and mitigating risk for the corporation, right? That a lot of the time comes back to interpretation and application of the regulation as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, to that point, thinking about our recent experience, 2017, if we'd had in-house legal advisor, good chance we wouldn't have ended up in that litigation we did in 2017 and saved a whack of dough that year, just because it would be so much easier to say, well, let's run this past legal, or in fact, legal would be sitting here and put up your, and say, maybe you want to reconsider that. So there I could see a cost saving simply by having somebody that's involved with the high-level planning and discussions here. Just a thought.
Can I ask another
Councillor McGowan?
question? So, to use that as an example, would a generalist have been able to have caught that, what we were doing? Or, and I guess that's kind of where I'm going. It's, we're talking about planning and we're talking about hiring in-house legal counsel, but that was an incident specific to interpretation of regulation as well as the MGA and the MDP, or sorry, the MGA and the MDP. Yes. So is a generalist actually going to do what we need them to do? Do we actually want them to have a major in land use planning and a minor in HR to be really basic?
Yeah, and I'm looking at Ms. Smithers again. She wants to jump in here, and I'm going to let her because she certainly worked with in-house counsel before.
To me, it's not, it's a generalist, but in the context of municipalities, right? So there is a whole specialization around municipal law. And to me, that's really what it is, right? Because within that, there's a subset that is planning, but it's really municipal law, right? What are the rules and regulations that we operate under? Are we interpreting them and applying them correctly?
So we are looking for a specificity within our general, as a generalist.
That's municipal. I wasn't
Like when I
involved in
think of
putting
a
this together, but I would think it's
specific
around municipal
position, I
law.
think we now have a transportation engineer as opposed to a municipal engineer, as opposed to an engineer, right? And so there's differences in the work that, there's more focus rather in the work that those three do, with the last one being with the least focused.
Yes, and they all work under the same regulation generally.
No, and I understand that, but I can't imagine that a real estate lawyer here in Canmore is going to be have a specificity in municipal law. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. Like, in your presentation, you said it was somebody that was a generalist, but I'm actually thinking that we're looking for somebody that's more focused, that can pick up all that other stuff more easily. Do you know what I mean?
I believe I understand what you're saying, and when I use the term generalist, I was looking at the buckets that we currently use legal counsel for. So, and there, within each of those buckets, there are specialties. There are lawyers who only do contracts and agreements. There are lawyers that only do HR or LR matters, union negotiations, those kinds of things. And so we're not looking for a labor relations specialist. We're not looking for a contract agreement, a specialist. But to use Ms. Smithers' framework of a municipal law component, there are whole firms that specialize in municipal law. Just in municipal law, right? And so there is that competency out there. There is that familiarity with the MGA, which would be ultimately, that would be a job requirement. We wouldn't want somebody to be learning that as they arrive here. So yes, we are looking somebody that has exposure to the municipal law realm and to the Municipal Government Act and the regulations and the municipal development plans and other bylaws and regulations that typical municipality acts under. And most municipalities once you get to, I think Okotoks and Airdrie are right at that spot where they have in-house counsel, so that 100,000 mark, we're far from that for sure. So the problem in Alberta is there aren't a lot of comparator municipalities like us, right? You kind of go to that mid-sized city and it's quite a jump. When you get there, then there's in-house counsel.
And it's a population jump.
Right. We did see, I can't recall which municipality it was, but they had actually a paralegal on staff that did some case management of files, but yeah.
Do you think that this budget amount is going to be enough to attract that kind of expertise?
So our HR department put that budget together based on our HR, our policy in recruitment, and so, yes, they did comparators. They looked at what in-house council's making in our comparator municipalities.
And then they did an adjustment for cost of living.
No, we don't add cost of living to our,
No, I'm being very pointed.
Right. We did look at the 55 percentile, because that is where our pay band is, but no, beyond that, we don't.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Comfort?
So further to the issue of pay, it seems pretty thin.
It is
To
thin if
attract
you
the kind
want
of person
partnership,
you're
yes.
looking for.
In the legal, yes. I would say if you're working and you're working towards, becoming a partner in a downtown law firm in Calgary, this salary is not going to be attractive. There are lawyers out there that are looking for a different experience and work-life balance, and that might be who we would be attracting.
That's, okay. Even so, it seems pretty thin. Just, I know several lawyers. And
Yes.
I gave birth to one.
So, but this is what this is what lawyers
But-
make at
but-
municipalities.
Well,
It is.
It's interesting because that particular lawyer has made a lifestyle change because he has a child now, and he was on the partnership track, and even so, this is not a lot of money. So the expertise that you're looking for, you want someone who's bright and snappy and like ready to go. It's a lot, and given our cost of living here and cost of housing, it's going to be tough to find someone. That's all I'm just,
Yeah.
I appreciate that, and I think it's important to know that HR did a lot of research and brought forward a number that they think is reasonable. If you look at GM recruitment, for example, a GM position at the City of Calgary, it's a very different salary than what you get at the town of Canmore. But there are people we know who are willing to make lifestyle choices, and it's still a good living and not impossible to live in Canmore and do it. So I appreciate what you're saying, and I also think HR considers all that when they do their analysis and bring it forward, and they're confident in what they've put forward.
Right, but there was also a, like a provisional thing that if we didn't get people applying at that salary, that they would sweeten the pot, as it were, by adding, I guess, a holiday time maybe, or flexibility, or whatever else can be managed.
Well, certainly we wouldn't have approval to add budget. So, and we have to live within our policies around vacation time and salary, wages, and benefits, I should say, and health spending accounts and things like that. So really, there isn't an opportunity to go outside of those policies without council approval.
Okay. All right, I'm just, expressing my reservations.
Yeah, no, and that's fair, and certainly should this be approved and we are unable to secure an appropriate in-house counsel, then we would continue to use external counsel and move forward in that regard. Councillor Sanford, did you?
Yes. I was just looking at the variety of duties that an in-house counsel would be assigned, and one of the things that I think is really important is handling the bylaw prosecutions, because I think that as an organization, we have good intentions of delivering that service to the community, but we know that it's very challenging to prepare the documents and get ready for court and, meet all the statutory requirements and then bring things to a conclusion. So I would expect that some of these duties are very repetitive. There'll be documents that are repetitive, but you just have to know the stream and you have to be up on producing the needed requirements to get things from A to, to completion. So I think that having somebody in-house is probably fairly valuable for some of these processes that are fairly
Yeah.
repetitive.
So if you look at the actual expenditures from 17 to 18 and 19 under bylaw reviews and prosecutions, the jump was a $10,000 jump to 2018 and it's staying, I mean, we're going to surpass that in 2019. That's all around the tourist, the visitor accommodation and short-term stay rental. That's what that bump is, because we hadn't been enforcing that and taking those to prosecutions, and now we are, and we've had one judicial review on one of those. So those, that's why you've seen that bump there. But creating that expertise in-house around that issue would certainly serve us, I think, moving forward.
Yeah, I think that we could probably head off a lot of our problems by having good advice up front as to what's worth pursuing and what's not worth pursuing. And I think we can find things that are more worth pursuing that come along regularly, things that we do regularly that are worth keeping an eye on that way. So I think this is a good idea.
Okay, well, we'll have opportunity to debate potentially today or next week, yes.
Right, and I agree with Councillor Stanford's last point. But to Councillor Comfort's concern, so, I mean, at this time, council has the ability to increase that budget. I mean, if council feels that it's really an important new position, and just our uber concerned that the 170 is not adequate, council could increase that. I think it would make more sense for us to proceed with this recommendation and see what administration comes up with, and they'll come back and say, you know, we're getting a lot of good interest, but it always comes down to the compensation. So, but I also think it's good time to be considering this opportunity.
Okay, well, that was good discussion. Thank you very much, and we can move on to the next item then.
So moving on to another capital item. So this one's for some climbing flooring replacement. An increase in budget and scope of $22,000 that we're proposing come from the Asset Rehab and Replacement Reserve. We do have a current approved project, which is for the covers only for the flooring of $40,000. The revised budget in total would be $62,000, which would allow for covers and foam for the high traffic areas. So this is page 33 of the agenda package. My understanding is that replacing the foam during this recasing will avoid additional service disruptions and additional costs in the future. Any questions around that one? Moving on, a couple more capital projects. So this is the one for corporate digitization. So that's page 36 of your package. I will try to say that more clearly. So we do have an unfunded project in there right now for $190,000, and that was to have the planning and development land files converted from paper to digital. So the original one had that done by contract staff to prepare the files for digitization, and now they're able to provide that through their approved operating budget. So this is only the digitization itself that they're asking for at a significantly reduced budget of $35,000 that we're proposing come from general capital.
Just curious, so 520 boxes totally, containing a total of 2,000 files? I mean, there must be big files if you only get 4 per box.
They are big files. they contain a lot of drawings, right? So just, it's all those, yeah.
Right. So all the drawings and everything would be digitized.
Correct.
Yeah.
There's nothing else on the digitization. Wow, I'm having trouble with that word. The next one's for PC lifecycle replacement, so an additional $10,000 to come from the asset rehab and replacement. This is something that IT brought forward, and there's an increased emphasis on laptops and the peripherals that come along with that, and so proposing an additional $10,000 to cover those costs.
Questions? Okay, moving on.
Next one is a new rubber surface for the Three Sisters Playground. So you may recall earlier I mentioned that there was an item that kind of was across 2020 and 2021. So this project was originally scheduled to be completed in 2021. However, this is a joint project with the parent committee, and they've been able to raise $140,000 and access some grant funding. So there's some momentum on their part to move this up by a year in order to use that funding. And for the town, it would decrease our contribution to the project.
So from the background materials, I understood that if they don't use it now, they're going to lose the funding, the grant funding. Is that right?
That's my understanding.
So is that, given the cuts that we've seen from the province in other areas, is the current funding at risk at all? Because things that were...
As far as I'm aware, the current funding has actually been approved. So my understanding is unless we do not use it by the timetable of next August, then we run the risk of losing it and possibly not being able to get it in the future.
Okay.
But the current grant is approved.
Is secure.
Is secure.
Okay.
CFEP, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So just to that, so 67,000, about half of the project cost, or of the monies they raised were from CFEP, right? And then they raised another 50% through other means?
Yeah,
Right.
largely fundraising. This is a very active group who have been successful. As council may recall, they were the impetus for the structure itself. Now they've just come back for phase 2 to rubberize the surface.
And I really think we should be encouraging and supporting projects like this that community groups will go out and do the heavy lifting on, and good for them. Happy to support.
There's nothing further on that item. We also have the Legacy Trail project with Town of Banff. So this is kind of a historic piece. So in 2015, Council approved the allocation of some of our FGTF grant funds to the Legacy Trail project. Reciprocally, the Town of Banff had allocated some of their FGTF funding for the Legacy Trail extension to the Travel Alberta site here in Canmore. There were some delays in the project, and ultimately we ended up closing the approved project without that transfer of funds happening. Now the project is being brought forward again as it's nearing completion, and we're asking for approval to release those funds.
Yeah, so I think that was covered, but are there questions on that and how we got there?
And the final item is in relation to the water utility. So, Mr. Como, if you're comfortable coming up and speaking to this one. I think this is one of the items you had alluded to earlier, Mayor Borrowman.
So what we have here are, we're in the water utility at this point. And so they are very much related, these projects. So I'm going to begin with the first one, which is the $405,000, which we're currently using right now as a placeholder. EPCOR has approached the town of Canmore and indicated that they are looking for a substantial increase going into 2020. So this is just a placeholder, as I mentioned, and the idea is that once that new value can be negotiated and agreeable by both parties, that we'd be coming back to council to do for an approval to do the adjustment. So we currently have this there as a placeholder. But partly because they are asking for an increase and we are approaching the 20 years into the agreement, we also felt it would be prudent to go out and just validate that we are getting good value for service. And so the second project is to do a review of the entire utility and to determine, are we getting good value? So that's a $70,000 review that would be occurring in the first part of 2020.
Are there questions on that? I just have one question, Mr. Como. So the intent of that service review, would that be looking to validate the increase for 2020, or what exactly would happen between now and sort of the finalizing of that $405,000 number?
So there's a couple things at play here. The $70,000, to answer your first question, was to answer some fairly key questions for the organization. Are we getting good value with our current service provider? So what we are being asked to pay based on the services being delivered. That could be one of the recommendations, is that is good value, and for us to continue with our current provider. The other possible recommendations is that we're not necessarily getting good value, and it would be prudent for us to go out to market and determine if there are other players out there that would be able to provide the same service at perhaps a better value. The other third option would be for the municipality to look at bringing the service in-house. So those would, I think, be the categories of the recommendations that would come out of that survey. The survey, or the review we anticipate would be about 6 months. And depending on what comes out of that, we may need to exercise our ability to provide notice without cause to EPCOR. And so back to the first part is we need to, based on 6 months to do the review, 18 months if we do decide to provide notice to EPCOR, is that we would, that's about approximately 2 years, and we would need to come to an agreement on how we manage the next 2 years with EPCOR based on the request that they have for additional funds.
So the 70,000 is clear in my mind, I understand that. So the 405,000 as a placeholder, so trying to think of other times we've put placeholders in the approved budget. Is that, have we done that?
We have done that for capital projects outside of the approved plan, so we have monies identified for it.
I think the unique circumstance here is this is in the utility, so it doesn't impact taxes. We always need to set a budget, so we need to have a number in the budget. This would be the number that would go in the budget if approved. There's already a number less than 405,000 less than this in the budget for 2020. So this would be a budget amendment to the water utility to increase the operating cost of basic work for EPCOR by $405,000. And my understanding from discussions with Mr. Como is that the utility reserve could be used to offset this cost so that the rates would not need to increase next year. So that is another portion of the budget, is council sets the rates, the utility rates to fund the basic work. So just if you could clarify that, Andres.
Yeah. Right now, when we have inputted this value in the 2020, we are not expecting that the rates need to be adjusted. However, going into 2021 and future, the rates will certainly need to be adjusted from where we had originally projected before we got notification.
So it would be in the budget approved as a placeholder, but with the funding source identified. And ultimately, would it come back to council for, it would, for a decision on how to proceed?
Yes, the intent is we've just begun discussions with EPCOR, so we need to finalize those. So we are expecting to come to council in early 2020 with a letter of understanding on how we deal with the interim during the review and the request that they have. So at that point, council would make a decision on the exact details once they've been finalized by both parties.
Okay, I get it then. But so the 405,000 would still be in the budget and would reduce what's available from that funding source by 405,000.
So if 405,000 is the exact number, then we're not looking at any change other than some of the conditions, additional conditions within the letter of understanding. If the value is to be less or greater than that 405, then we would be making a request for a decision on those as well, so that we would adjust the budget and the utility accordingly.
Okay.
I have a question. So this utility service agreement review is coming towards the tail end of our contract with EPCOR, correct?
Correct. Our contract comes due at the end of July 2020.
Oh, July? Okay.
Yeah, that's when it formally would end the 10-year term.
Okay.
But there's a condition in the contract that if either party does not serve the other one notice greater than 18 months from that date, so we've passed that date, that the contract automatically renews. But beyond that, there is still the provision within the contract to give either party 18 months notice without cause.
Okay, so the contract would renew, but if this service review indicated to us that we need to do something different, then we would have 18 months to give them notice that we're doing something different. Because
Correct.
we will, but it's not really, it's not extending the old contract, like, because we kind of do that with snow removal, don't we? We sort of extend the old contract. But this is actually a new this would be a new contract?
The difference with the snow removal is there wasn't a provision for an extension. This one automatically rolls over. The snow and ice control did not. That's why we were doing extensions formally.
Right. So we would essentially, if we were going to do something different, we'd have to renew the contract, but then take 18 months to give that notice.
Yes.
Okay. And the contract would end on July 2020?
No, the contract right now, if we were to give notice today, for example.
No, but I'm just saying that the 10-year contract was, you said July?
Yes, the end of the first term, the 10-year term, would end middle of next year.
So July 2020?
Yes.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Okay, any further questions on that one? Thank you, Mr. Como.
So that concludes all the individual budget amendments and our discussion around them. So again, just an overall summary of where that leaves us. So from the approved budget, we had started at an approved tax increase of 4.6% net of growth. Those are the operating items we had just discussed that do have a tax impact, resulting in a net $69,000, which would bring the total tax increase up to 4.8% net of growth. And there were an additional 4 changes that we talked about, those transfers or ones funded from reserves that don't have a tax impact. Moving on to the capital side, my apologies. There has been a correction that Mr. Irwin has identified that we'll need to make, mainly administration regarding that first item, the climate change plan initiatives. That was the one where we had $55,000 that was going to come from general capital and then $5,000 from a grant. So here I should have specified that the total amount of the project, so we don't have to come back to you for approval for that additional $5,000 should we be successful in receiving the grant. That total should read $60,000, $55,000 funded from general capital, $5,000 from reserves. And that would bring the total at the bottom up to $1,684,000. Or page 36 of the slides, if you're looking at those. Okay. So when we are grant funding, it would be only $55,000 of our own money, so to speak, but we should have included that $5,000 in the grant there as well.
So looking at the budget, the project sheet, it just, as you say, references the 55,000 coming out of general capital reserve. There should also be, what was the amount?
$5,000 for the grant. So the total project should be $60,000.
Right. Right. Grant, thanks.
So overall, in terms of where that leaves us, So as discussed, we have a net impact of $69,000, which is an additional 0.2% increase in taxes, net of growth. Then we have those transfers within or between departments for the sustainability expenses and some engineering expenses. And then we have the increased power expense in the water utility that's offset with a reserve. We've also had the deep utility work was a significant debt project. So overall, we're sitting at 62% of our debt limit for 2021. And then there's also two big projects that are contributing to the increase. We have the placeholder for the fire hall in there as a reminder, and there's also the Pump House 2 treatment capacity upgrade. Councillor McCallum? 2021.
So are we at 62% of our own imposed debt level or of our, provincial debt level?
Provincial.
Of the provincial
Getting
debt.
head shaken on different things.
So just to be clear, our imposed level is 70% of the
Yes.
provincial?
So that's the black line.
That's the black line?
So
and
are we 62% of the black line
No.
or 62% of the red line? That's what I wanted to be
62% of the
sure.
red line.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Any questions on the debt chart? Okay.
Then once we move on to debt servicing, the debt is obviously, we're getting closer to the lines than we are in debt servicing. So similarly, there are the same restrictions on the debt servicing, the cost side. Again, our self-imposed limit is at 70% of the overall 100% limit that's specified. So our cost of debt is currently quite low, so this is less of a constraining factor for us. Interest rates are quite low right now, and also we have a number of older projects that were at those historically higher interest rates that have been dropping off this schedule. Any questions on the debt servicing?
Oh, sorry, Ms. Richardson, we're just trying to remember what you said about what was in the 2021 big jump. That was fire hall and?
And the Pump House 2 treatment
Pump House 2.
capacity upgrade.
Okay, great,
Yeah.
thank you.
I think that was in the magnitude of 8, memory serves. Any other questions on debt at all? Moving on to reserves. So this shows where our reserve balances are sitting after the proposed reserve funding for the projects discussed. Mayor Borman?
I'm just assuming that all of those reserves are within the parameters that we've established for various reserves through the reserve policy.
I believe they are. The one, I think water might be slightly below, but we do usually look at water and wastewater together, and so combined, we are sitting above the minimum required reserve per our policy.
So it appears that with the changes reflecting what we're discussing today, the reserve levels are still healthy.
Correct. Any questions on anything to do with any specific reserves?
I have a question. So the development reserve is, can you just clarify that for me?
So the development reserves, so they're a little bit different, and they don't have a specified balance. It's really just what's collected through the development, so they're a little bit unique. So for example, the cash in lieu of parking that we talked about funding a couple of projects out of, it's really how the projects that we're bringing forward meet the criteria that's specified for that reserve, but it's different than the other ones in that there isn't necessarily an identified either dollar value or tied to something else value. So for example, for general capital and asset rehab replacement, we talk about it being sufficient to meet the planned expenses over the 5 to 10 year time frame, but the development ones are a little bit different in that they're not as specific in our reserves policy.
Is that where the photo radar reserve would be? No, that's different.
No, that's mostly the offsite levy reserves and
okay.
cash in lieu of parking and cash in lieu of bare bins.
So the green is the offsite levy reserve. And other things.
And other things we
okay.
collect from developers for a
Oh, okay.
specific purpose.
Okay, I thought it was the offsite levy reserve, but I wasn't really sure if there was something else in there, okay.
Yeah, so the offsite levy is definitely the biggest
Okay.
contributor. The projected 2019 ending balance, that's 5.5 million of the 6, so the offsite levy is far and away the largest, but there is cash in lieu of bear bins, cash in lieu of parking, cash in lieu of municipal reserve, a recreation levy, so there are some smaller pieces in there as well.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Just out of curiosity on the cash in lieu of parking, is there still, is that sort of, are there regular contributions to that still? Is that?
So that would be decided at development. I think, I'm trying to think if I've heard of
No,
one.
I mean, I'm going to guess that that reserve is slowly going down
Yes,
because there's less developments occurring that would be contributing.
right. It's only development downtown that
Right.
contributes to that, right?
Yeah.
So we were, can't remember where it was, that we were looking at the base camp building just beside us, and they have actual on-site parking and a parkade. So, that would have been a location where we might have seen cash in lieu of parking collected.
Right.
But
Just for future consideration, I mean, we're funding some things out of that cash in lieu of parking, and I think it may be considered a dwindling source of funding.
Yeah.
Any other questions on anything pertaining to the reserves? So that summarizes the impact section I had. One of the other items was this requirement to formally cancel the 2019 projects which have not been initiated. There was a table in your agenda package about this. So there were only 3. The first is our Shared Information Governance Services Project 7056. That was for $30,000 and was to implement a regional model for providing information governance services, but never proceeded because of some staffing changes in our partner municipality. The next one is the Temporary Public Art Project, which was 7057 for $15,000, and the staff resources were shifted away from that project to the Organic Spin Art Project. And finally, there was the Stones Canyon Creek mitigation, 7023 for $80,000. That mitigation work ended up not being a requirement of the development, and I believe at the time that project was brought forward, it had been identified that that mitigation work might not be required. Any questions around any of those projects? So that concludes my presentation. So there were the 3 motions that were recommended, and then per conversations with Ms. DeSoto, could be discussion about whether we would like a separate motion for the transit items.
Yeah, and certainly open to the Finance Committee's direction on whether you would like to have separate motions for each of the line items. There's a couple that would be combined, and we could do that. But at this point in time, the motions that we would be looking for and could start to go through the discussion and debate on them are really the 3 that are there, and we can pull out any specific line items, for example, legal counsel or transit. After Mr. Bean's presentation, I thought it might be valuable to have a separate motion on the transit increases so that we could forward that to the commission to show that that's been approved or denied. So that would be something we could certainly do. Are we prepared to move forward first? Okay, I will move that the Finance Committee direct administration to bring capital projects 7056, 7057, and 7023 to council for cancellation. Is there any discussion on that motion? Okay, seeing none. Those in favor? Any opposed? That's carried unanimously. And then looking to the operating amendments then, I'm going to, could you put that, yes, that table, that's great. So I will just look to the Finance Committee right now for discussion. Would you, there's probably 10 or so individual line items. A couple of them can be grouped together. Would you like to discuss and approve these separately?
Just use the sort of the same process we use for the land use bylaw, where you put the
Okay.
motion forward to approve all of them, and if somebody wants to amend that motion to pull something out, then
Sure. Okay. I will then move that the operating budget amendments as, okay, I'm going to read the motion
probably a
completely.
good idea.
I will read it. Here. That the Finance Committee direct administration to bring the 2020 operating budget amendments to council as presented for approval. If there were any exceptions to that, we could pull out the line items that are accepted there.
And sorry, one item I might interject. As a reminder, there were 4 additional items that didn't have a tax impact that I believe would still be included in the operating impacts.
Okay, yes.
So that was the 2 transfers between departments and the items from the utilities reserve, just so those don't get lost.
Is everybody clear on that addition that Ms. Richardson just identified? Okay, are there any specific, Mayor Borman, were you wanting to put amendment forward?
No,
No.
the motion's on the table, and
Okay, good.
nobody's putting forward any amendments. We can discuss the main motion.
Any discussion on the main motion then? Which is to approve all of the operating, yes, Mayor Borman?
I'll support the motion. I think it's pretty realistic, or it's a healthy conversation we've had in the some of the changes. There's not any really aggressively difficult changes to imagine. The in-house legal counsel, we talked a bit about that. I'm very supportive of moving forward with that addition, and hope that we'll finally get good applications with that proposed budget, but we'll also recognize that CAO may come back and say we need to tweak that line item. I really think increasing slippage, given our experience over the recent years, is a good thing to do. And there's nothing in that list that will cause great worry for me. So I'll happily support the motion.
Councillor McCallum?
Yep, I will support the motion. I've heard quite a bit of defense from administration as to the number that they've chosen for in-house legal counsel, so I'll see how that shakes out, and we still have time before it comes to council for us to actually approve this. The other thing I'm really going to be scrutinizing is when, in the new year, when the overnight parking on municipal lots initiative comes forward. We need to get that right. And so, yeah, I'll approve this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other comments or discussion on that motion? Councillor Sanford? It didn't come on. Yeah.
I think we took the time to discuss each one of these quite thoroughly, so I don't have any problem proceeding with the list as presented. And I thank administration for all the hard work to pull this together and give us a good insight into what the bottom line is. The net changes are $69,000. That's pretty amazing that we could do all that, adding and subtracting, and come up with $69. So I would certainly support that.
Okay. Any other, okay, that's Councillor Comfort.
Yeah, so I was the one that expressed doubts about the in-house legal counsel allocation. And I just want to say that that's not because I have any lack of faith in our HR department or any of that. And I'm pretty sure that we'll be able to adjust it as need be if it comes to that.
Thank you. Okay. Seeing no more discussion, I will then call the vote on the motion that the Finance Committee direct administration to bring the 2020 operating budget amendments to council as presented for approval. Those in favor? Carried unanimously. Then we'll go to the capital budget sheet up on the slide. And I'll put the motion on the floor that the Finance Committee direct administration to bring the 2020 capital budget amendments to council as presented for approval. And I'll just move the amendment to that very first line there, the climate change plan initiatives, that be changed to be $60,000 in total, with $55,000 coming from the general capital reserve and $5,000 coming from grant. Any discussion on that amendment? Seeing none, I'll call the motion on the amendment. Those in favor? That's carried. And then so back to the main motion to approve all the capital amendments or direct that they be taken to council for approval as presented. Is there any discussion on any of that? Seeing none, I'll call the motion. Those in favor? Nobody's opposed. Carried unanimously. I think that was it. So motion to adjourn the Finance Committee. Those in favor? Carried. Wow.